Good evening, everyone. Sorry to interrupt all the discussion, but we probably should get underway. A, because you might be hungry, and B, because we don't want to keep anyone too late. And we're very lucky to have the Attorney General with us this evening, but he does have to go back to Melbourne and catch the last flight. So we have to let him go in enough time. So I'm Gillian Siegel, the chair of the General Sir John Monash Foundation. And on behalf of the foundation and the executive who's here, I'm going to introduce Paul shortly, and my fellow directors who are here. Can I welcome you to our 12th Leadership Oration? And can I thank CBA for again so generously hosting this event? And can I thank their team for putting this wonderful event together? Don't you think they do it well? Could I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present? And can I welcome many valuable CBA clients and friends, as well as many long-standing friends and supporters of the foundation? Thank you all so much for coming. And could I just take a moment to introduce you? I know this will embarrass him, but I nevertheless want to introduce you to Paul Ramage, who's the newly appointed CEO of the John Monash Foundation. Paul, will you stand up just so everyone knows who you are? So if you haven't already met him, please take a moment during the evening to introduce yourself to him. As I'm sure you know, the foundation's mission is to raise funds for and then select outstanding young Australians for scholarships to study overseas at a postgraduate level at leading institutions, and establish international networks while they're there, and then return to Australia, hopefully to further develop their leadership with assistance from our growing Leadership Academy, and become networked and connected leaders for Australia, each in their chosen fields. And we now have 264 outstanding scholars, having just completed our selection process for 2024 with another first-class cohort of 16 amazing individuals, 4 of whom are from this 2024 year, I think, are here this evening. And there are 20 scholars in the room with us. So you should each have a scholar or two at your table, and after main course, I think we'll be doing what's called the Oxford Shuffle, and those scholars will stand up, and you'll get 2 more scholars or 2 different scholars to chat to. And they represent diverse disciplines. Of course, they've had their diverse experiences overseas and they bring their own passions, but they have one ambition, and that is to deliver positive outcomes for Australia. And they represent, I think, in this time of great international uncertainty, a very positive future for the country. So each oration that we've had has focused on different aspects of leadership, from leadership in the military, which was our first oration with the Governor-General, politics, we've had a Prime Minister speak to us, law, we've had a Supreme Court Justice, science, business, education. Each has been delivered by an eminent Australian and commented on by a talented scholar. So tonight the focus is on transparency and accountability as leadership attributes of good government. And we are thrilled to have the Attorney General deliver the address with a response from Dr Danielle Roosa, a 2004 scholar, our first year of scholarships. So can I personally thank Andrew Hinchliffe, who I'm going to call to the stage shortly, for being such a great and consistent supporter of the foundation. We truly value our 10-year partnership with CBA, and thank you for being the CBA champion and custodian of this long-term partnership. CBA was there at the beginning of the foundation, which is a reflection, I think, of its own values and its belief in the importance of leadership. So thank you, CBA. I know there are always ups and downs, but we really appreciate the bank being there for leadership in the nation. And we look forward to another 10 years, perhaps. Andrew was appointed Group Executive Institutional Banking and Markets in August 2018, and he joined the Commonwealth Bank as Executive General Manager of Global Markets in 2015. Prior to that, he had a wonderful career in investment banking in London, New York, and Australia, variety of leadership positions at Goldman Sachs. And he was a member of the Goldman Sachs and New Zealand, Australia and New Zealand Operations Committee, and a director on the board of Goldman Sachs Financial Markets. He actually commenced his career as an oil and gas design engineer after graduating with honours with a Bachelor of Engineering and Commerce from the University of Western Australia. So it can show you how far those oil and gas guys go. He went on to complete his Master of Business Administration at the Stern School of Business in New York in finance. So he really gets the value of an overseas postgraduate experience. Thank you, Andrew, and can I welcome you here to introduce our guests.
Thank you. Thanks, Gillian, for that very warm welcome. And my background, oil and gas, I'm very focused on sustainability these days, as you'll be pleased to hear, Attorney General. It's fantastic to be here. Before I go any further, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to the 12th annual Sir General John Monash Foundation Oration. As Gillian said, we've had a long history with the foundation dating back to 2004, and we're extraordinarily proud of our association with the foundation, coming up to almost 2 decades. The scholarship program fosters the talents of extraordinary young Australians to make an incredible contribution to a given field and the country, and they will broaden their academic and industry network to hopefully, blaze a trail for the next generation who are focused on that particular field. We've sponsored 13 scholars in that time, CBA scholars, and that's across a range of different disciplines, ranging from sustainability, from economics, engineering, science, and public policy. I'm delighted to announce our latest scholar, Georgina Ryan, who is an applied mathematician with a background in physics and chemistry. And Georgina's focus is to increase the mathematical literacy of the general community, but in particular for the underrepresented groups that are young women and people with disabilities. I'm also delighted to welcome the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus KC, tonight. Mark was appointed to the Attorney General and Cabinet Secretary position in June 2022. He served in both of these roles once before and has been a Member of Parliament for Isaac since 2007. And prior to his parliamentary career or political career, he spent 2 decades in the legal industry focused on constitutional, commercial and environmental law. He served on the Australian Legal Council as a director, the Victorian Bar Council, as well as the Victorian Bar Ethics Committee. He's led the government initiatives around an anti-corruption commission, the Royal Commission into the robo-debt scheme. Is also the abolishment of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, as well as reforms for the Privacy Act. As one of the country's most esteemed politicians, he is a strong advocate for social justice, as well as environmental sustainability, but also as a fierce defender of freedom of press. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Attorney General of Australia, Mark Dreyfus. Thank you.
Good evening all, and thank you very much, Andrew, for that warm welcome. Could I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of this land, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Can I acknowledge my friend, Jill Siegel, the other directors of the General Sir John Monash Foundation, John Monash Scholars, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to present the 2023 John Monash Oration. It's a particular delight to join you as the Foundation celebrates 20 years since the first cohort of John Monash Scholars was chosen. I've had the privilege of meeting many of your scholars, and I've been so impressed by them that I've employed 2 of them. John Monash famously said, and I quote, "The privilege of education carries great responsibilities. It is given not for individual benefit alone, but to befit persons for the higher duties of citizenship and for roles of leadership in all fields to make Australia great." My Chief of Staff when I last served as Attorney General was the 2014 John Monash Scholar, Jim Round. Since leaving my office, Jim has had a very fine career with the Victorian Government. Like so many other scholars, Jim's contribution to Australian life honours the faith invested in him by the Foundation. Another scholar has since joined my office, Chloe de Souza, a Noongar woman who was the 2020 and inaugural Bob Hawke John Monash Scholar, has been my Indigenous Justice Advisor since soon after the last election. With her scholarship, Chloe completed a Master of Laws at Harvard University. Chloe applied for the John Monash Scholarship because she wanted to be a leader for her community. During her studies, she focused on ways law and policy have historically harmed First Nations people and sought to understand how better outcomes could be achieved, particularly in relation to the interaction of First Nations people and justice systems. Chloe took classes that discussed the therapeutic responses for young people interacting with the justice system, and also heard from people who had served time in prison in the United States. Chloe graduated a few days after the last election and wanted to return home and work for a government committed to improving outcomes for First Nations people. I am delighted that she did, and I couldn't be prouder of the work that she's done. Over the past year, Chloe's been an advisor to the government on the Voice referendum and on our new National Justice Reinvestment Program. She's worked alongside First Nations leaders and leaders in government, including the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney. Chloe and Jim and all the other scholars give meaning to Monash's words about the real value of education, the opportunity it gives you to make a bigger contribution, including in leadership roles. I completed my formal education long before the General Sir John Monash Foundation was established. But like many in this room, I recognise that my education opened a world of opportunity for me. It has been the bedrock on which my long career in the law and politics has been built. Not all leaders have a good education, but everyone with a good education has the opportunity to lead. Tonight, I want to talk about 2 aspects of leadership that I value most: transparency and accountability. At the bar and in the Parliament, I have pursued greater transparency and more accountability from those who exercise great power. As a barrister, I worked on the Stolen Generations case between 1998 and 2002. The case was brought on behalf of Lorna Cabillo and Kumanjai Gunnar, now both deceased. We sought to address injustices associated with actions taken in the Northern Territory up until the 1960s. Sadly, at that time, Aboriginal children were removed from their families, taken long distances from the communities of their birth, and made to live among strangers in institutions that bore no resemblance to a home. They were denied the opportunity to grow up surrounded by the love of family, to speak their own languages, and to learn about their own country. Tragically, they were treated as orphans when they were not orphans at all. We sought to hold the Commonwealth accountable for its actions and deliver long-delayed justice to Ms Cubillo and Mr Gunner and other members of the stolen generations. We failed. The case was lost, but the cause was not. The very first day I sat in the House of Representatives, the 13th of February 2008, was the day that Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered the national apology to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, particularly the members of the stolen generations. Lorna Cubillo, my client, sat on the floor of the House as an honoured guest. As a barrister, I represented clients who challenged the limits of state power and championed the right to know. From FOI matters in the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal to environmental and climate cases in the Supreme Court of Victoria and free speech cases in the High Court of Australia, I prodded and probed laws that worked against transparency and accountability. A maxim from rabbinic Jewish tradition provides, "It is not incumbent on you to complete the work, but neither are you at liberty to desist from it." I came to the Parliament determined to pursue the things that I really cared about: transparency, openness, accountability, access to justice, climate action, and Indigenous rights. And I hope 6 terms later, my time in government and opposition reflects a certain doggedness when it comes to those issues. I've never played to the press gallery, nor sought plaudits from social media. I am a member of the Labor Party, a party born of the union movement that prizes solidarity, a party of government. I haven't won every argument I have presented internally, but I have won enough arguments to demonstrate the value of focus and persistence and commitment to our democratic process. Improved whistleblower protection has long been an interest of mine. Fortunately, in my first term in Parliament, that interest was shared by Senator John Faulkner as Special Minister of State. Senator Faulkner asked me, as Chair of the House Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, to examine the feasibility of a Commonwealth public interest disclosure scheme. Building on the work of Senator Barney Cooney a decade earlier, I recommended a new Commonwealth scheme. It took longer than I had hoped for the Labor government of which I was a member to adopt my recommendations. As it happened, I was chair of the parliamentary committee that recommended a new scheme, and later the minister who brought whistleblower legislation to the Parliament, which was in 2013. One of my proudest achievements in my first period as Attorney General is the creation of the Commonwealth's first public interest disclosure scheme. One of my proudest achievements in my second period as Attorney General is enhanced protection for whistleblowers acting on recommendations the previous government ignored. Last week, I released an issues paper seeking views on a further tranche of whistleblower reform. As Attorney General, I don't comment on matters before the courts, and I don't comment on commentary about matters before the courts. But the fact that I am the only Commonwealth Attorney General to have introduced public interest disclosure legislation and have now done this both times I've held this position a decade apart demonstrates my commitment to protecting whistleblowers. As Attorney General in the Albanese government, I've worked with my Cabinet and caucus colleagues to advance reforms I believe make Australia a better place to live. Many of them promote greater transparency and accountability. The foremost among these reforms is the creation of a National Anti-Corruption Commission. The former government promised to establish an Anti-Corruption Commission. It delivered nothing but empty words. Ahead of the 2022 election, I said that if elected to office, we would legislate a powerful, transparent and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission by the end of 2022. We honoured that commitment. The legislation for the Commission was introduced within months of the election and passed before the end of the year as promised. The new National Anti-Corruption Commission began its work on the 1st of July this year. The Commission has strong powers to detect, investigate and prevent corruption across the entire Commonwealth sector. It operates independently of government, with discretion to commence inquiries on its own initiative or in response to referrals from anyone. It has the power to investigate allegations of serious or systemic corruption that occurred before or after its establishment. It is overseen by a powerful parliamentary joint committee established by statute. It has the power to hold public hearings in exceptional circumstances and where it is in the public interest to do so. It can make findings of fact, including findings of corrupt conduct, and refer findings that could constitute criminal conduct to the Australian Federal Police or the Commonwealth Directorate of Public Prosecutions. Legislation establishing the Commission provides strong protection for whistleblowers and exemptions for journalists to protect the identity of their sources. It may seem trite to say, but sometimes what you don't do matters as much as what you do. Not appointing the Prime Minister to hold secret ministries is a good example. Prime Minister Albanese has not been appointed to ministerial portfolios without the knowledge of his cabinet or his ministers or the public. In addition to abandoning one of the more bizarre practices of the former government, the current government has agreed to publish ministerial appointments, including acting appointments, as an act of transparency. Following a royal commission, the government has also resolved to take comprehensive steps to ensure a scheme like Robodebt can never happen again. I will bring legislation to the Parliament before the end of the year to advance the biggest reform to Australia's system of administrative review in half a century: the abolition of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and the creation of a new Administrative Review Tribunal. Crucially, all members of the new tribunal will be appointed through a transparent and merit-based selection process. I have reformed appointment processes for the Federal Court of Australia, the Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia, introducing advertisements, expressions of interest and selection panels. The government has legislated transparent and merit-based selection processes for the Australian Human Rights Commission, not just to prevent the downgrading of the Commission in international forums, but in recognition of the important role it plays in the protection and promotion of human rights for all Australians. In June this year, we implemented a long-neglected recommendation, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, by introducing real-time reporting of deaths in custody. National real-time reporting of deaths in custody enables greater public transparency of deaths in custody and accountability of all governments for their criminal justice systems. Internationally, we've acted to hold the Russian government to account by pursuing Russia for its role in the murder of passengers aboard MH17 and its illegal invasion of Ukraine. I took active steps to cause a version of the sentencing remarks of the convicted person known as Alan Johns to be published for the first time. Under the former government, this person was tried, convicted and imprisoned in secret, something that must never, ever happen again. I commissioned a comprehensive review of Commonwealth secrecy offences with a view to identifying unnecessary, ineffective and duplicative provisions. This week, I released the report of that review and committed to eliminating 1 in 5 secrecy offences on the Commonwealth Statute Book. I have legislation before the Parliament to enhance oversight of intelligence agencies by the Inspector-General of Intelligence and Security and the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. I hope that with its passage, a better balance will be struck between individual liberty and national security. I believe effective oversight improves the performance of our intelligence agencies and enhances national security. As Attorney-General, I have removed gag clauses that stop legal assistance providers in receipt of Commonwealth funding engaging in advocacy. I was appalled by these gag clauses in opposition. in government, one of the first conversations I had with an Aboriginal legal services provider was with an Aboriginal services legal, sorry, start again. One of the first conversations I had was with an Aboriginal legal services provider who told me they couldn't talk to me about funding because that was prohibited by their funding agreement. This had to change, and it has. Rightly, there is a great deal of focus on the need for government to be accountable for its actions. I agree entirely, but government is not the only powerful institution in this country. We've passed legislation to make not only government employers, but also business more accountable for poor conduct in the workplace, including acting on a recommendation in the Respected Work Report by introducing a positive duty on employers to take reasonable and proportionate measures to eliminate sex discrimination, sexual harassment and victimisation. I have legislation before the Parliament to hold business to account for foreign bribery activity, and I'm consulting on reforms to ensure more businesses and professionals play their part in preventing serious criminals engaging in money laundering and financing of terrorism and child exploitation activities. We're about halfway through the first term of the Albanese government. The reforms I've outlined aren't the sum total of my work to date and don't include significant reform like prioritising the best interests of children in the family law system. So much of what I've done and hope to do as Attorney General concerns transparency and accountability, not as an end in itself. Bad government that is transparent is not better than a bad government that is not. But transparency has a tendency to make governments and institutions be better, if only out of a sense of self-preservation. I want to end with a reflection on a passing connection I have with John Monash. We went to the same school in Melbourne, albeit many years apart. While I was at school, Monash was often referenced for his wartime service. But what resonated with me most was his ethos of service to the community. Growing up in Melbourne, Monash's tangible legacies, including the State Electricity Commission and the Shrine of Remembrance, were ever present. But for me, his commitment to service was and is his lasting legacy. This commitment is reflected in the scholarship program we are celebrating tonight. It is reflected in the stories of the scholars who have studied abroad and made a contribution to Australian life on their return, stories that now stretch across 2 decades. It has been an honour to join you this evening. Congratulations on 20 years. I extend my best wishes to the 2024 scholars and the many scholars to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attorney General, for your extraordinary leadership over a long period of time and all that you've accomplished. I'm now going to invite our next speaker to the stage, Danielle Roosa, who is one of our original 2004 John Monash Scholars. Danielle is a senior counsel at the World Bank and previously worked at the National Native Title Tribunal and most importantly is the mother of 5 children while she's doing all of that as well. So Danielle is going to provide a response to the Attorney General. Please welcome Danielle to the stage.
Thank you, Andrew. Attorney General, what important and thoughtful comments you've given us tonight on transparency and accountability, the essential elements of good leadership. It takes personal courage, leadership and commitment to deliver transparency and accountability in Australia's public institutions. And it's not everyone who could rise to that challenge. On behalf of the General Sir John Monash Foundation and our guests, I pass on my sincere appreciation to you and to the government. Attorney General, members of the Monash Board, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to speak today on transparency and accountability. I'd like to discuss those themes today as they relate both to public institutions but also as they relate to our personal lives. When our public institutions fail to be transparent, when they fail to be accountable, democracy suffers. Corruption, the most extreme form of that failure, is a scourge on democracy. It undermines our trust in institutions and in the very fabric of our polis. If citizens cannot rely upon the rule of law, if political representation becomes distorted and precious public resources diverted, public trust in government can be damaged, leading to cynicism, disengagement from the political process, and a decreased willingness to participate in elections or democratic activities. Failures in transparency and accountability also have very real consequences for economic growth. I work for the World Bank, whose mandate and overwhelming focus for the last 70 years has been poverty reduction. Corruption is a fundamental barrier for poverty reduction. It affects all levels of society, but it disproportionately harms the most poor and the most vulnerable. It's very hard to quantify the true total cost of global corruption. One popular estimate is that more than $2.6 trillion, or 5% of global GDP, is lost to corruption annually. Is that figure accurate? Well, it's hard to say, because corruption is more than just money passing in an envelope under the table, or the public funds diverted to Swiss bank accounts or Bermudian shelf companies. It's the cost of citizens who are not provided an education that can lift them out of poverty, or their children, or their grandchildren. It's the cost of widespread unaddressed health issues in an economy. It's the lives that are lost when a dam wall, whose maintenance has been chronically ignored due to corruption, breaks and takes the lives and livelihoods of those downstream, and the cost of rebuilding. It's the cost of illegal fishing, deforestation, the trade in wildlife, and even human trafficking. It's all these multiple and generational costs to which corruption contributes and compounds. Among all the crises facing the world today, climate change, to conflict, food insecurity, energy crises, inflation and debt, and recovery from a global pandemic, corruption cuts across them all. The World Bank fights corruption at multiple levels. One of those is involvement in stolen assets recovery. I worked for one of those cases as the bank's lawyer for Central Asia. Now, a few years back, a certain long-serving president of Kazakhstan, so loved by his people that he always managed to get 99% of the vote, decided that he didn't much like his son-in-law. As you do when you're in a position of such power, the president issued a decree to divorce his daughter from his son-in-law. The ex-husband wisely fled. And as the story goes, the president then called the Swiss authorities to report that his son-in-law had corruptly transferred funds from the treasury account to his own personal accounts in Switzerland. He also reported the same for his political opponent. Now, the Swiss are meticulous bookkeepers, and as they searched their records, they realized there were no such transfers. But what they did find was the president had transferred some $115 million from the country's treasury account into his personal accounts. That transfer briefly passed through the US bank account of a middleman, attracting the jurisdiction of the US Department of Justice under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The middleman was arrested, the disputed funds were frozen, and sensitive negotiations began between the Swiss, the Kazakh president, and the US Department of Justice. In the end, the agreement was made to repatriate the funds back to the country, but only if those funds could make it back to the very poorest citizens of Kazakhstan. That's where the World Bank came in. As the World Bank's attorney in that matter, my job was to liaise with the legal teams of Switzerland, Kazakhstan, and the US, and to put in place a legal framework for a program that could repatriate the funds back to the poor Kazakhstan. That's tough. How do you disperse $115 million in a timely way to the very poorest of a country's citizens in a way which will have a positive development impact and which won't be siphoned off by the country's elites? After all, this was a country whose banks, whose postal service, and every organ of government answered to the president personally and was staffed at the highest level by people who owed their comfort to him. Government poverty data couldn't be trusted. We knew the lists included a large number of government cronies, so the difficulty wasn't just figuring out how to get the money to the poor, but who to get it to. In the end, That program ran for 5 years. The cash went to assist families to care for disabled children in their home rather than in institutions, to finance scholarships for vocational training, and to incentivize pregnant mothers to come for regular prenatal checks. But that success didn't come easily. For the bank staff, despite the immunities and privileges we enjoy as employees of an international organisation, we knew our hotel rooms and our offices were booked. So we enjoyed many a long walk by the frozen rivers of Astana, talking through the legal arrangements and program operations. Others paid a heavier price. One of the local nationals and the first chair of our foundation spent 2.5 years in a gulag on trumped up charges. For him, the cost was very personal. His health suffered. He lost his freedom and he lost precious time with his family. But this was a cause in which he believed and which he'd fought and continues to fight to this day. The lesson is that corruption is insidious, but it's imperative we fight it. And that brings me to another aspect of today's theme I want to talk about. Until now, I've talked about the importance of institutional accountability and transparency. As a democratic society, we've become very good at finding fault with our material and our non-material institutions, and rightly so. But there's another aspect of accountability and transparency that gets less press these days, and that's personal accountability and transparency. If we think about integrity as a set of values that encompasses transparency, accountability, honesty, and consistency, are we always as vigilant in pursuing integrity in our own lives as in our institutions? And I'm going to be a little lighthearted here. As you've heard, I have 5 children between the ages of 5 and 10, including 2 sets of twins. As you can imagine, this presents some real work-life balance issues, but that's a topic for another day. But being a parent is a constant exercise in leadership. Much of what I've learned about leadership, about integrity, I learned from being the parent of 5 children. Let's start with honesty and transparency. Now, I'm going to leave aside here Santa, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy, who I have to say needs to work on her backstory. What do you say when your 5-year-old asks you, why is this fairy collecting children's teeth to begin with? I mean, it's pretty creepy when you think about it. What the heck does she do with these things? Are they recycled? Does she put them back into the mouths of new babies, or does she hoard them somewhere? I mean, there's just no backstory there. There's no feel-good story about bringing joy to the world. Just a fairy that has an uncanny sense for when your teeth are going to fall out and who's going to creep into the bedroom during the night and exchange them for cash. I've been left short of words on more than one occasion when fielding that question. But let's leave aside these childhood narratives, which may take us away from honesty and transparency. Everyone has a view on them, but for us, we value the sense of wonder they embody, the expression of love and goodwill, and the lessons of unconditional giving and joy they create. And, mea culpa, I admit I'm guilty of recreating little rabbit feet in the flour my oldest kids dusted around a carrot they left for the Easter Bunny in an attempt to delay their doubt. If you must know, it worked. I know, judge me. But that aside, children have brutal honesty. They won't hesitate to ask their uncle why his belly is so large. They'll ask older dinner guests why they have so many lines on their face. They'll say with utter sincerity how they love how squishy and soft mummy's tummy is. For the record, it's not true. It's like steel. Okay, well, maybe not, but it did birth 5 children, and I remind them what a great miracle and blessing that is. Children keep you honest. You need to live the values you teach. One of my dear friends tells the story of being pulled over for low-level speeding. When the officer asked her if she was aware she was speeding, she answered no. And I kid you not, her 6-year-old daughter shouted, "Yes, you were, Mummy. You said we had to hurry on and get home because you had wine with lunch." She got a ticket. But more importantly, it reminded her of the importance of walking the talk, leading with integrity, consistency. As any parent will know, children will call you out on this. It's not just consistency of application. Why, for example, isn't you reaching for a biscuit a breach of the rule not to eat before dinner? Won't you spoil your appetite? No, it's consistency between them. We all want a fair go. We aspire, after all, to a country, to a world where everyone gets a fair go. I've long since learned to avoid the kind of battles that would have my children ask why one got chocolate tiny teddies and the other got honey. In our house, it's one in, all in. You have to pick your battles, and I'm not willing to go down fighting on tiny teddies. Accountability. We've talked a lot today about accountability of institutions, and the same is true in our house. There is an integrity commission, and it's board members of the Roosa children, Barrett, Reese, Flynn, Isabella, and Ryan. Like the new National Anti-Corruption Commission, there will be referrals, there may be investigations, and there will surely be a report. They hold us to account, and they hold each other to account, particularly the latter. He's drinking milk from the container, mummy. He took an extra lolly, mummy. She didn't brush her teeth, mummy. It could be and is any number of reports throughout the day. Of course, at these ages, it's more about getting their sibling into trouble than holding them to account. But there is an important lesson to be learned there about oversight and the consequences of your actions. We've always tried to lead by example. Sometimes we've succeeded and sometimes we've failed miserably. We're only human after all. In our house, we've tried to teach the kids to treat others with respect, understanding, and kindness. We don't swear, and we teach them the power of words, how words can inspire and how words can harm others. One day recently, my 6-year-old came home and announced that his friend James had used the F word. I was alarmed. We don't use that language at home, and I had no idea how he even came to know the phrase, the F word. It took me a few seconds to figure out how to proceed. So I asked for clarity. James used the F word? Did he say the actual word? He sure did, mummy. More thought. Did the teacher hear him say the word? I asked. No, he was in the playground. More thought. So when he said the F word, what exactly did he say? It was only then that I learnt that little James had called a snail fat. That was the F word, fat. To this day, I have no idea how my son even came to know the phrase the F word, but I do know that to him, it means to call something or someone fat, and they've been taught it's unkind to call someone fat, and well, I'm good with that. Look, I don't mean to make light of these important moral values. It's only to note the ways in which we are challenged every day to act with accountability and transparency, to lead with those values. We would all do well to speak with the honesty and guilelessness of children, to call ourselves to account, even as we look to change our world. This brings me back to the General Sir John Monash Foundation, where so much of the focus is on creating future leaders who can and do lead with integrity in all their diverse fields. Like the Attorney General, we look to them to deal with the crises and complexities of today's world, to be honest brokers who hold themselves and our institutions to the highest standards, and who are adaptive thinkers whose thoughtful reflections, humility and integrity guarantee them the convening power they're going to need to tackle the difficult challenges of our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for those excellent words. I mean, hearing your Kazakhstan story, it does make you realise how lucky we are to be in this country with the leadership that we have. So, and equally, as a father of 4 children, I totally agree that they're a great leveller. I'm now going to invite Attorney General and Danielle back to the stage. We're going to do a very short Q&A, about 10 minutes. Your dinners are coming out. Please get your questions ready. If you'd like to come back to the stage very quickly, thank you. And given it is short, I'm going to throw straight open to the audience just to see if there are any questions that you'd like to ask.
Say. No, we don't need a mic. They're not going to questions.
Sorry. One at the back. Here we go.
Question to the Attorney General. So you talk about not winning all the battles. Can I ask you about a time when you have compromised and been very happy that you did so, for whatever reason that might be?
Next question.
Question is that I'm part of a collective, and we do have collective solidarity, and I'm trying to think of a suitably benign example that might cause grief to people. I make compromises a lot, because that's the art of politics. I make compromises internally with my own members of my own party, with members of cabinet, and because I'm part of a government that does not have a majority in the Australian Senate, I have to make compromises to get legislation through the Senate more often than you would think. And I would point to, I'm not going to list them, but I can point to a range of bills that I've had to make a compromise with either the formal opposition or the other group who can deliver a majority for Labor, being the Greens Party and the crossbench, that I've been happy in the end to have the legislation pass, even if I've made some compromise along the way. But I'm not going to give you a specific example.
Gillian?
Could I ask you a bit about the future rather than past? I know that there are so many challenges that exist in our frameworks in society, but that need legal structures in order to facilitate their interaction with a harmonious society. One of the ones that we face that is the talk of scholars, in fact, that we have in 2024 is artificial intelligence. Where is that going? How is it going to affect the way we operate? And how will we know who is indeed inventing something, creating something, doing anything? What are your thoughts about where the government might go? Because it relates to ultimately transparency and accountability. Is it the people? Is it artificial intelligence? Where are your own thoughts as to frameworks that should be put in place to continue the rule of law and all that you've spoken of? I'm not asking you to see the future, but it is a major problem for us, and I'm sure you've given it some thought.
We've just started to think about artificial intelligence, and I think that's so across the world. We are right at the start of a very, very difficult period of how to make systems just grapple with technology that was undreamed of when these legal systems came into existence. I've got a small part of it directly in my portfolio, which is the Copyright Act. I'm the Minister responsible for copyright in Australia, and copyright is I think it's probably fair to say a 19th century invention. You can go back to some common law cases in the 18th century, but in terms of it being an international scheme, it is a 19th century invention, and it predates entirely the technology that now shapes our lives in every respect. And depending on how long I'm in the Parliament, and depending on how long I'm the Attorney General, I may well get to amendments to the Copyright Act that somehow seek to engage with artificial intelligence, but no country has yet engaged with this. I'm watching people in the US start to talk about it. As a government, I've got a Minister for Industry and Science in Ed Husic, who is deeply interested in artificial intelligence. I have a Minister for Communications in Michelle Rowland, who is trying to engage in regulation of platforms and communication in the context of artificial intelligence, but I can say we are just at the start of this. So is starting to think about it, as are governments across the world. And I'd add in the related, I can't work out where to hold the microphone. There's a related topic of automated processing, which is a close relation of artificial intelligence. the possibilities that digital technology have provided us in terms of automated processing is something that we've had a close encounter with in the Australian government in the form of RoboDebt, which was an automated processing issue. And I would like to think that in having a Royal Commission, it did not, I had thought that it might go forward towards looking at the automated processing issues of principle. It ended up not doing that. It looked much more closely at the way in which ministers and senior public servants had dealt with that topic. But again, you've got a brush there with how our legal system and our system of government is going to actually interact and have to interact with the use of technology. I don't think any country has got this right. Privacy is another area for which I'm responsible, where issues of artificial intelligence and automated processing are writ large. Thinking about it, I wish I could give you a better answer, Julian. We're at the start, and I know that the next several years, not just for the Australian government, but for the government of every developed country, we are going to be engaged with how to regulate artificial intelligence, how to properly grapple with the ethical issues and the legal issues that come out of big data, automated processing. We're nowhere near the end result that we will need to get to.
Down the front here on the right. Yeah, that's you. Yeah.
This one for you too. It's the question about what role you see for the development of human rights frameworks under law in this country, including enshrining treaty obligations that we've signed up to in relation to openness and transparency and accountability in this country.
I'm going to say, David, that I'm conscious of the many international treaties that Australia is a signatory to. I'm going to try to make sure, as far as I can, as a member of the cabinet in our government, that where it arises, we adhere to our international obligations. As it happens, the very first bill I brought to the Parliament is about how we choose the office bearers of the Australian Human Rights Commission, the 7 commissioners who occupy those statutory positions. Because when I came to office, Australia was in breach of our obligations with the United Nations as to how we conduct our national human rights organisation, which in our case is the Australian Human Rights Commission. We're under threat of being grey listed, which would have meant that our Australian Human Rights Commission would not have been able to participate fully in the work of human rights that is done at the United Nations. I corrected that by requiring forever after, in the form of legislation, that there will be, and I mentioned it in the speech, and I'm very proud this was the first bill I brought to the Parliament. Simply, it's a simple thing, but an important thing to say we are going to have merit-based, transparent appointments processes for our commissioners at the Human Rights Commission. More generally, there's a range of human rights and other international treaties that are given some effect by Australian domestic legislation, but there's more to do.
The back corner, there we are.
This is actually a question for Danielle. Lovely to see you
I
again.
hope it's a softball question.
Given your experience at the World Bank and your passionate defence of democratic principles, I'd be interested to hear sort of comments around the challenges facing the democratic project right now, and how you're thinking about the global environment in terms of some of those democratic fundamentals being not uniquely something that exists in particular countries, but some seeking to advance across the world.
You know, the bank, as you probably know, has an economic mandate set out in our Articles of Agreement. It works very hard, and we also have, coupled with that, political prohibition, which requires the bank and its officers and our organs, such as the Board of Governors and our Board of Executive Directors, to make decisions only based upon economic considerations. That said, there is still a lot you can do to realise some of those democratic values within that economic framework, because the two often go hand to hand. We do have justice reform projects, for example. We do often involve ourselves in projects that finance budget transparency and accountability through development policy loans of that kind. One matter that I dealt with immediately in about 2010, I was the bank's lawyer for Egypt, and all throughout the Arab Spring, I was the bank's lawyer for Egypt, Libya and Yemen. And we introduced a development policy loan right after the revolution, $1 billion to incentivise accountability and transparency in their budgetary system, which reflected the calls, some of the calls of protesters at the time, of the people at the time. There's an interesting story with that, because that loan never went ahead. What actually happened is I was studying Arabic at the bank. My level is not great, but it was just so that I could introduce myself to the delegation when we were in town and speak to the Minister of International Cooperation in an introductory fashion. But as I went through the interim constitution, I realised that the Arabic version of that constitution critically missed one word that was the English version. And that word was critical for what we were going to do, because it meant that the decrees we were asking the government to pass would no longer be constitutional, and we would have had $1 billion going out the door for something that they couldn't have achieved. And the money is fungible in a development policy operation, so once it's gone, it's gone. So I picked up the phone, I called my counterparts at the Islamic Development Bank and said, hey, I'm just reading the Constitution in Arabic. And as I said, I didn't have a great skill level, but I do notice that there's a word missing here. And what do you think about that? Because they've just lent $1 billion. Oh, we didn't read it. Oh, interesting. Well, I'm not the one that can opine upon the Egyptian constitution. So we went to Egypt and we met the Minister for Justice, and lo and behold, they couldn't do what we were asking them to do. That loan didn't go ahead, not because of scuffle, because of anything that I'd discovered, but mostly for political reasons. But I give that story just to as an exemplar of the kind of work that the bank does in this field. And the bank often does work in, I guess, project work or policy work in what you might call things that intersect with democratic values. And that's one example. But that was not a softball.
Yeah. This is going to be the last question, by the way. We're going to let our guests to have some dinner. Go to the front.
Thanks so much for that overview. To commend you on your reform agenda on anti-money laundering, which you mentioned. I think it's extremely important and relates to some of the remarks that were made by Danielle as well. But on that point, one of the challenges, as you would know, is certain vested interests and positions of various groups in a reform process. And in that particular case, including from your own professional background, who are resistant to reform. I just wanted to you to comment on how you think about that kind of situation where you have a principle or a reform that you think is important, but you're coming up against various viewpoints that may be for legitimate or maybe sometimes less legitimate reasons are resistant, and how you think about sort of driving change and leadership in that context?
It's good that you mentioned principle in your question, because that's where I go. I stick to principle. It's probably the only safe foundation from which you can mount an argument that you will be able to carry through. And of course, in democratic countries, we are beset by people who have vested interests. We are beset by people who have special interests, who are not afraid to put forward their special interests and argue for them, often fiercely, and often, well, sometimes not dressed up in principle at all. It's just a straight up claim, think about us. And I do think you're more likely to win arguments in a democratic polity than not if you stick to principle, and it's a safe guide. The anti-money laundering is a good example because there's something that I come to office having watched for 9 years while an agreement that Australia made in 2014, which was to move to what are known in FATF, which is the financial transactions body based in Paris, that is the international anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing body. Australia agreed 8 years ago to what are known as the Tranche 2 reforms, and they require that a regulatory scheme be put in place to regulate my old profession, the law, and to regulate real estate agents and a range of other financial intermediaries. Australia has simply sat on that. We are going to do it partly because it's right in principle, partly because to join the rest of the world, and partly because of an actual threat that the rest of the world has made against it, which is that Australia will be grey listed. There's another area where it would be to our detriment in international forums to not get this right because we've let it go for so long. But I propose to talk about this on the basis of principle when we get to it. And I'll no doubt be resisted by a range of people with vested interests who don't want to have to comply.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the formalities for this evening. Let me start by firstly thanking Gillian for your leadership and all the John Monash Foundation leaders that make this whole program possible, as well as the oration. So thank you very much. And Paul, we wish you all the best in your new role. But please join me in thanking the Attorney General and Danielle for, I think, an outstanding oration. Thank you very much.